Hello DP Review TV viewers, Don Komarechka here for another fun video looking at the art and science of photography. Today we are going to be looking at bokeh. Bokeh effectively has a number of meanings for different people and you might pronounce it in different ways. I'm calling it bokeh. Bokeh is effectively when you have something that's out of focus. And it's more prominent when you have a specific light point, a specular highlight that then falls out of focus. That singular point of light will have different characteristics based on the lens that you're using it with. Now, specular highlights can come in all sorts of fashion. You could have light passing through trees and have small little light points in between the leaves. You could have, with examples that we have here, mineral samples that have all sorts of crystal facets that will reflect in very interesting ways. So let's talk about what bokeh is not. Bokeh is not a shallow depth of field. It often shows up in out of focus details, which means you cannot have infinite focus from front to back in order to see it, but any lens is capable of producing quote unquote bokeh. The quality of the out of focus details is what we're talking about. Now, you can't overuse these things. You can't abuse them in certain ways, like putting Christmas lights in front of your video. That's cliche, that's a gimmick, and yes, we're doing that to tell a point here. But let's try to find artistic ways for us to use out of focus details to make our art have an extra little bit of punch. Here we have a fairly simple setup. We have a mineral sample here. This is a piece of quartz crystal that has been sprayed with titanium dioxide. It creates a crazy color effect through thin film interference that basically makes the quartz crystal into rainbows, and that, when you have specular highlights, makes some beautiful rainbow bokeh as it comes out of focus. We are using a pretty old lens, the Canon MPE65, because it has a 6-blade aperture. And that's important because bokeh will always take on the shape of the aperture that you have in your camera. So 6 blades turns into a hexagonal bokeh effect when things fall out of focus. Modern lenses and more expensive lenses will have 9 or 11 blade apertures, which are very smooth, and you don't quite see that same level of geometry. Now, it's not needed to use a macro lens to get bokeh, but it tends to have a greater out of focus background in macro photography, which is where it becomes more useful. But you can do this with portraiture, you can even do this with landscape photography. So now we have a lens that is known for its specialty bokeh called soap bubble bokeh. This is a Trioplan 100 from a company called Meyer Optic. It's called a Trioplan, Trio for the triplet design, which dates back to, I believe, 1906. So the Trioplan 100, when things fall out of focus at a completely wide open aperture, the outer edge of the bokeh becomes brighter than the inner area, making it look like a bubble. So triplet designs have existed for a long time in photography, and usually cheap projector lenses from the 1950s are triplet designs. So I picked this one up for about $15 on eBay. It's a Zetar 100mm f2.8 lens. You don't have to get this lens. Almost all old projector lenses are triplets. So with this, I'm going to try to mount that on my camera. It's not going to be an easy process, or at least there's no conventional way to do this. So I've discovered my old Canon Auto Bellows. Let's see if we can get this to work with this. Whatever works, right? The Trioplan 100 sells brand new for $1,000. This projector lens cost me $15. And the Auto Bellows, probably no more than $50 to $70. So here we have a vintage lens, a Zenitar 50mm lens. Classic vintage lenses will often have characteristic bokeh. That's why a lot of people seek out these vintage lenses, not just for stills, but for video. It has a different feel for it. This particular lens has a fairly interesting soft bokeh. I kind of like it, but why don't we take this lens apart? They're super cheap. I bought these for around $15 to $20 a piece. Let's put the optics back together in an improper way and see what happens. There we have a lens with an internal element that's been reversed. Why? Because we can. So we've reversed an internal element on the Zenitar 50mm lens because when you muck with optics, you can create some interesting things. In focus areas are now not exactly what they should be. It's not going to be crisp, it's not going to be clear. But the out of focus areas, when you switch this lens, it has a soap bubble effect, but it's also pulling towards the edges of the frame, which artistically could be valuable. Heck, it's fun. We're here to have fun, right? Just having bokeh doesn't make an interesting image. It might make some abstract artwork, but how do we use that as a component in an actual photographic composition? So in this experiment, we have a flower, and it's placed a couple of inches in front of the crystal that we are using to create bokeh. The flower is being lit by one LED flashlight, and the background is being lit by another, and we have the camera that is shooting in very close to the surface of the water to get some nice surface reflection. We're using the Trioplan 100. It has that soap bubble bokeh effect that is going to come into the background and frame the flower very nicely. While this setup works exceptionally well for stills, and I've got a great still image as a result, it doesn't have to be static. We can use this on video. And if I take one of the lights and make it rotate and pan across the scene, then you will see the specular highlights, the bokeh that is out of focus in the background, will change dynamically as it's being shot. You don't always have to keep this just to stills. Things can be a lot more dynamic when you add motion. Well, that worked surprisingly well. Simple ingredients, again, you can put these together fairly easily and experiment. You don't know exactly what puzzle pieces are going to fit together in the right way, and here was just one example. I can spend an entire day doing very similar examples. And if you want to see some of those experiments, feel free to follow me on social media, on Twitter and on Instagram, and on my podcast at photogeekweekly.com. And don't forget to subscribe to DP Review TV, where more of these videos will be featured. Thank you so much. So one final thing, we can start to modify the shape of our bokeh, and we are not dependent on just being a perfect circle or the geometry of our aperture. In this case, I have a little attachment that I've designed for the end of a lens. It's basically an aluminum lens cap that I've cut a hole in, and I've put some little holder pieces of metal on the side. I can then slide in a piece of clear acetate that I have printed off of my inkjet printer with an aperture of my own design and shape. This just sits right in front of the lens, and your aperture is now the shape of whatever shape you have here, and that will come through in the image. I'm not going to say this is going to be a success. This is purely experimental, and some of this will turn out to be garbage, but at least it's fun in the making.